Have you ever experienced the tension between knowing that there's a right choice to make in your life, but then even though you know the right choice to make, you still find yourself making the wrong choice for some reason? Whether it be maybe for you a relationship you keep going back to that you know is toxic, that you know is bad for you, but you still choose it anyways, or maybe it's just a playlist. It's a song that you know is going to put you in your feels, but you still listen to it anyways. Like, that tension is very real. We have a tendency to think in a way like we know something is true, yet we act and we live out what's exactly opposite to that. And I want you to know that in my spiritual journey, in my journey with God, as I've tried to pursue a life that I believe God is calling me into, I recognize that tension is there too. I know that I've been saved from a life of sin, from living a life where I'm defining good things, beauty, purpose, meaning on my own terms and in my own pursuits of money, power, sex, whatever it is. I know that I'm saved from that pursuit because Jesus has saved me, and he's given me an opportunity to live a free life apart from living a life of sin and a life with him. But the tension still exists because I know that, I believe that, I profess that, but in my day-to-day life, I still find myself living as if I'm enslaved to those practices, as if I'm enslaved to sin. I want you to know, as I've been studying the Bible and as I've been specifically reading the words of Paul, I recognize that Paul actually brings out this tension in a lot of his letters to the church. In Romans chapter 6, he says this starting in verse 1. He says, "Should we keep on sinning so that grace may increase?" He says, "By no means. We are those who have died to sin, so how can we live in it any longer?" Then in verse 6, he continues and he goes, "For we know that our old self was crucified with him, so that the body ruled by sin is done away with." So Paul recognizes that we no longer need to live a life enslaved to sin because we've been freed by grace through Jesus. So why would we live that way? But then understand, the same author, just a few paragraphs later in chapter 7, starting in verse 18, he says this, "For I have the desire to do what is good, but I can't carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing." And then he continues in verse 21, "So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. But I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me." So Paul recognizes this tension that even though he knows he is saved, even though he has the opportunity to live a life apart from sin and in step with the life and the free life God has called him into, he still feels the tension of wanting to live as though he's still a slave to that thing. So it's a tension there. And then on top of that, he actually, in other parts of his letters to the church, and really throughout the whole Bible, we get this picture that there's also another force at work in this tension. In Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 12, Paul says this to the church, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." So not only are we navigating this tension in between ourselves to know that we are freed from sin, but still living a life as if we're enslaved to sin, but there's also these dark forces, these evil forces that would try to coerce you and compel you and deceive you into thinking that those are the right choices to make, that you should still live enslaved to sin. And so not only do we deal with that tension in between ourselves, we also have these other forces at work. So what do we do about this tension? Knowing that there is a tendency within us to live as a slave to sin, even though we are freed by Jesus, and knowing that there's these powers that are at work that would tempt us and coerce us and deceive us to actually living that life of sin despite the freedom that we have. What do we do about it? Well, when Jesus is teaching his disciples how to pray, and he's teaching them how to pray and to pray these things regularly, he says in the last line of his prayer, he says to pray this, "God, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." Because Jesus recognizes that we need to learn on a daily basis how to live as a free person. You see, there's a difference between being freed and actually living as a free person. You see, the work of Jesus Christ is that beyond none of the work I could do and nothing I could earn, God has freed me. And through the work of Jesus, God has freed me from sin. But I need to be led in my day-to-day life how to live as a free person. Now you may be asking yourself this question, well, why is it that when I'm saved, why don't I just change? Why isn't my thinking changed? Why can't God just immediately transform my thinking to where I stop wanting to live a life of sin and start wanting to live like he lives? Well, let me ask you this. If when you were saved and when you professed Jesus Christ as Lord, God just shifted your thinking and changed you immediately, let me ask you that. Does that sound like freedom to you, or does that sound like coercion. You see, there is a beauty in choosing a life of freedom and choosing a life with God versus him just forcing you to live that way. And that's the reality of the tension we live in, is that we are saved, not from any work that we've done, but of the work that God has done through Jesus. But we need to continually live as a free person in order to fully work out who God has called us to be. And so when he's teaching his disciples how to pray, Jesus says to pray regularly. Lead us not into temptation. God, lead me away from the thinking that meaning, purpose, and value and good things can come from me or the things I pursue. Lead me away from that and deliver me from the evil one. Deliver me from the deception of these dark powers that would lead me to believe that those things are true. Lead me to believe untrue things about me. Lead me to believe that I'm not enough, I'm worthless. And so when Jesus is teaching his disciples to pray, he's teaching them to get into the rhythm of asking God to lead me into a life of freedom. And that is the beauty of the conclusion to the Lord's Prayer. My name is Zach Bazansky. Thanks for listening to my short sermon.